Hello everyone, happy Holy Saturday. I just want to spend a little bit of time today talking to you about fear and about what we do when we are feeling afraid. So today is Holy Saturday, the day between Good Friday and Easter. And oftentimes on Good Friday, we spend a lot of time talking about the grief and the sadness that comes with Jesus's death. But you know, fear was actually another huge part of this story. I mean, there's a reason that the main disciples were not there on Good Friday. They were not there at the trial. They were not there at the foot of the cross like the women were. They were not even really there on Easter morning, at least not the first people there. And all of that is because they were afraid. They were afraid for their lives and afraid the Romans were going to come after them next. And so on this Holy Saturday, it's a good time to talk about and think about what is it that we do when we are afraid. And I think the first thing to do is to simply acknowledge that fear and to know that it's normal to have fear. You know, in the Bible, there are a lot of passages that say, do not be afraid. But there are equally as number of passages and stories about people who were really afraid. And so if you are feeling fear, you are in good company. There is nothing wrong with feeling fear, but rather it's what do we do with our fear that matters. And so the first thing for me is just to acknowledge that fear, to name it, because when we do that, we can separate the fear from ourselves. And then we can look at it and turn it over and acknowledge it and name it and take that power away from the fear. Because fear can often eat us up from the inside. It can cause our anxiety to rise, can cause us to act in ways that we wouldn't normally act, maybe like buying up a lot of supplies at the store, might even cause us to lash out. Fear can do all sorts of different things to us, but when we separate ourselves from that fear, when we name it and claim it and acknowledge it and turn it over and talk about it, we take that power away from the fear. So I think that's the first step when we feel afraid. And then the second step is to just turn our attention towards something positive, to stop giving the fear all of our energy and attention, but rather to shift that focus to something positive and to our faith. You know, for me, the scripture that I always turn to when I'm feeling afraid comes from the book of Romans. And it's the scripture that says there is nothing that can separate us from God's love. Not height, nor depth, nor angels, nor demons, nor things to come, nor things present, not even death can separate us from the love of God. And for me, that is the thing that I turn to when I'm feeling afraid. Because it means that even if my worst fears come true, even if the worst thing happens, that God is still going to be right there. And that those fears and that thing that I'm worried about can't separate me from God. And so I turn to that scripture. I wonder what you turn to. Maybe there's a scripture verse or a practice that you turn to when you're afraid. I'd love to hear about that in the comments. Let me know what scripture verse you turn to. But by doing that, by turning my attention back to scripture and back to God, I'm able to re-ground myself and remember the promise that, you know, the story doesn't end with Holy Saturday. The story does not end today. The story continues on to Easter. And Easter reminds us that there is nothing that can stop God's love for us, and that love always wins over death and darkness and fear. And so today on Holy Saturday, I invite you to remember that promise and to turn to that promise whenever you're feeling afraid, to remember that God is with us, that God is faithful, and that God will be there always, even in the midst of our worst fears. So today, remember that promise and have a good rest of your Holy Saturday. And I look forward to celebrating Easter with you tomorrow.